Hey, First Unitarian. So it's a natural thing, an inevitable thing perhaps when we're young to try and figure out who we are. Like, who am I really? How much of myself will I allow the world to see? How much of who I am will I cover up or cover over with what the world expects me to be or wants me to be? Questions like, if I tell and show who I really am, what I really think, will people still love me? Will they even like me? You know, some of us, even some of us who are a little longer in the tooth, still wrestle with basic questions of who we are. I've had people in their 70s actively dying from incurable conditions confide to me that they just hoped they had gotten it right. Were desperate to be reassured that the person they had chosen to become had been a good person, and that no one knew they were really faking it, or had been for some time. Now, in my experience, that level of awareness is actually relatively rare. I think most of us, by the time we're in our 50s or beyond, have settled into being someone for so long and so thoroughly that we forget those fundamental choices we made many, many years ago about how honest of a person we would be, how giving of a person we would be, how faithful, how manipulative, how dedicated we would be to material success, or what we would willingly sacrifice to be liked or to be loved. But we did make those choices once. It's how we became whoever it is that we are at this moment. A couple of big choices, and then by millions and millions of smaller choices over years of time in relationships, both sustaining and trivial. Are we fair? Are we honest with money? Even with, the grocery store or a restaurant or the government? Are we truthful with our friends? Are we honest with our love? The truth is, almost all of us are astonishingly adept at being chameleons. Very different people when talking, for instance, to our boss or to our child, our sibling of 60 years or to a stranger, the waitress at the diner or the banker who is going to make a decision about whether we are worthy of that loan. Now, if you happen to have a multicultural background or speak multiple languages, you are intimately familiar with what they call code switching, affecting the lingo, accents, and behavior of the different spaces in which you find yourself. Black people in America do this every day of their lives, the way they talk, relate, and carry themselves with other black people in black spaces versus the way they talk and relate and carry themselves when they have to deal with white people, especially white people with power. These are social survival skills, and we've all got them. There's nothing wrong with them inherently. In fact, not having that particular set of skills is unusual enough that we even have names for people who don't or can't develop those skills. We call them autistic, or we call them Asperger's, or some other clinical label, and we treat them as if they're sick or abnormal, even though they may be some of the most authentic human beings we'll ever come across. Bronnie Ware worked in hospice for decades and wrote a popular book called The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying. And in her experience, this is what she writes: when people realize that their life is almost over and they look back at what they've done and who they were, the number one regret that they express is the wish that they had had the courage to be true to themselves, instead of living the life that others expected of them. People spoke in this book about spending decades and enormous amounts of energy trying to please other people, to live up to other people's expectations, or passing things by because it might have made someone else uncomfortable or unhappy or temporarily disappointed. Most people had not honored even half of their dreams. And in hindsight, They knew this was due directly to decisions they had made. Years ago, true story, I was hiking in the Rincon Mountains with a dear friend, and we were having one of those rare and precious conversations of truth and trust. We were both in a period of great transition in our lives. She was trying to decide in those weeks whether or not to terminate a pregnancy, and I was trying to decide whether I was going to go off to seminary. We were looking back on our respective paths, and we had this simultaneous realization that neither of us had a single regret about anything we had chosen to do. None of the decisions we'd made, even the ones that hadn't worked out or the ones that led to, the ones that had gotten painful, all of those had led to other things, and in the long run, it was all good. The things we regretted, all of them, the things we regretted were the things we hadn't done. The chances that we hadn't taken. The opportunities we had let pass us by. Looking back now, that was probably the moment I decided I would go to seminary. And she eventually decided to have that child who is now in their late 20s. No regrets. By the way, the other 4 regrets in that book, The 5 Regrets of the Dying, are people wishing they had expressed their true feelings, especially in their intimate relationships. People wishing they hadn't worked so hard. People wishing they had allowed themselves to be happier. And people wishing they had stayed in touch with their oldest, dearest friends. I think of the wise words when I think about social courage and who we are. I think of the wise words by Henry Nouwen that I love to quote. I've quoted these many times before. He wrote, "A little criticism makes me angry. A little rejection makes me depressed. A little praise raises my spirits. A little success excites me. It takes very little to raise me up or thrust me down. Often, I'm like a small boat on the ocean, completely at the mercy of its waves. All the time and energy I spend in keeping some kind of balance and preventing myself from being tipped over and drowning shows my life is mostly a struggle for survival. Not a holy struggle, but an anxious struggle, resulting from the mistaken idea that it is the world that defines me." On taking risks, Albert Einstein once wrote, "Once you can accept the universe as being something expanding into an infinite nothing, which is something, wearing stripes with plaid is easy." All of these take courage, which is what we've been talking about for a couple of months now. Courage is doing something even though we are fearful, even though we are anxious, even though we are uncertain, even though we know that what comes next will be painful or hard or might temporarily hurt somebody. Today we're talking about social courage, the simplest form of which is just being true to yourself, living your own life, not conforming your personality or who you are or what you do to other people's expectations, being truthful at the risk of social disapproval or punishment. But it's also being willing to admit mistakes when we get it wrong, being willing to apologize, being honest about how we feel and about what and who we value in this world. All of which sounds a whole lot easier than it actually is. But it turns out we have magnificent public examples of what this looks like. And I think immediately of Dr. Christine Blasey Ford, who testified with tremendous dignity, even though her voice was literally shaking at the confirmation hearing for Brett Kavanaugh. And I believed then and I believe now every single word she said. Senator Kamala Harris said of Dr. Ford, her story, spoken while holding back tears, shook Washington and the country. Her courage in the face of those who wished to silence her galvanized Americans. And her unfathomable service out of a sense of civic duty shined a spotlight on the way we treat survivors of sexual violence. Millions of women were inspired by that testimony. #MeToo became a worldwide movement, and I only wish the Republicans in that room had had 1/10 the courage that Dr. Christine Blasey Ford had at that hearing. I think about the Little Rock Nine, black high school students in 1957 who, in order to get through the thousands of name-calling, spitting, angry white people, required the president to nationalize the Arkansas National Guard to escort them to the door. And they went. They went to school. They attended classes. Some of them graduated from that high school. I think of Representative John Lewis of blessed memory, speaking up, speaking out, putting his body on the line over and over and over again, despite beatings, despite being arrested, despite death threats, despite everything, on and on. Just weeks ago, black people all over the country were putting their bodies on the line as they protested, calling for an end to police brutality and unnecessary force. I think about the wall of moms linking their arms together, putting themselves, their own bodies, in between the black protesters and the riot police. I think of the dads who showed up with their leaf blowers to disperse the tear gas. I think about members of this congregation who have marched and spoken up for racial justice, for marriage equality, for humane treatment of immigrants, and dozens of other causes. I think about all the people I know who have taken the chance of speaking the truth in love, speaking the truth to power, risking embarrassment or rejection for the chance at intimacy with another human being, from a desire for intimacy, showing the children what love looks like and feels like and smells like and tastes like, risking looking like a fool for love, because it's the right thing to do. Because so often the heart knows better than the fears in our head. Because justice deferred is justice denied. Because life without courage is only a slow spiritual death. Friends, this is my wish for all of us. Good fights to fight. Good trouble to get into. And the sustaining love that you need to keep going. Amen.